Our scripture reading this morning will be from Luke chapter 8, verses 49 through 56. While he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But when Jesus heard this, he answered him, "Do not be afraid any longer. Only believe, and she will be made well." When he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter and John and James, and the girl's father and mother. Now they were all weeping and lamenting for her, but he said, "Stop weeping, for she is not dead, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. He, however, took her by the hand and called her, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up immediately. And he gave orders for someone to be given something to be given to her to eat. Her parents were amazed, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened.
Had something interesting happen to me yesterday. It's not every day that I have something interesting happen to me. It used to be more often, I guess, but nowadays that we're all locked up, we don't get as much interesting stuff, I guess. But I was playing golf this last week, and I found several golf balls. I hit one into the pond, and I found several, and I was cleaning them up yesterday afternoon. I had bleached them a little bit, and I was scrubbing, and I found one. It was a Callaway, and it had this big Z on it. And as soon as I saw the big Z, I realized that was Pete Newman's N turned sideways. I hadn't seen Pete in 5 years. He's gone on to his reward. But I got one of his golf balls, and I thought that was really cool. I had to interrupt my wife and say, "Hey, guess what I just found?" And I even posted it on Facebook because it was really neat to see something like that. I played golf enough with Pete to recognize his N as soon as I saw it. And when I saw it was a Callaway ball, I said, "That's one of those that Elizabeth Morgan rescued and gave to him," because she used to do that on a regular basis. And I appreciate that a lot. Last week we talked about this kind of an interesting story, and we talked about this parenthetical miracle that they refer to it as, where Jesus healed the woman, and I always say the woman that had issues. The woman who had had an issue for some period of time. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul says that there is a most excellent way to live, and that way is the way of love. In the first 3 verses, he talks about this idea that love is more important than spiritual gifts or knowledge or faith or generosity or even being willing to die for Jesus. Love is more important than all of those things. And he says even if we had all that, if we didn't have love, it'd be like banging a gong at a pagan temple. And it wouldn't matter for anything at all. And then he tells us that love is patient and kind, and it's got a long fuse, and it's slow to boil, and it's all of these things that we've been talking about in our Wednesday evening series, Habits of a Loving Church. And so we look at that and we see that, and that's what I want us to look at this morning as we continue this same narrative. It begins with Jesus coming back from across the sea where the Gadarene area was. He had gone over there. He had healed the demonic. He had calmed the sea on the way over there. He had cast the demons into the hogs. They had run in. He comes back. There's a large crowd waiting for him. They want to hear him. They want to see him. They want to touch him. They want to do all these things. And that's where we're at. Read a story about a lady that, I'll tell you the story in a second. But first this, just a little bit. Would you consider the world we live in to be a kind world? When you look at the news and you look at the things going on, would you say we live in a kind world? The story of the lady goes something like this. She was at the bus stop and she had just gotten her income tax refund, and so she had more money than she was used to having, and she had cashed the check. And so she was a little nervous as she stood at the bus stop, and she saw this man sitting on the bench there, and another fellow walks up to him and whispers something in his ear and gives him a $10 bill. Well, she's got this extra money and she's feeling kind of generous, and she goes up to the man and she says, "Here, I want you to take this." And she whispers and she says, "Never despair, never despair. The next day, as she's getting ready to get on the bus, the same man comes up to her and he hands her $110. And she said, "What's this for?" He said, "Well, you won, lady. Never Despair came in, 10-1 odds." Now, I can't promise that all our acts of kindness are going to pay off 10-1. In fact, some of them are going to cost us something, and that's what we're going to talk about, is an act of kindness by Jesus that costs something. It's expensive sometimes to do good, and while we may look at it as not that big a deal, there's something here that sometimes we miss. And I want to go back to last week's lesson before we get into this, because there's something there that we didn't touch on that I was saving for this week. It says that this woman, Mark records, had suffered many things at the hands of many physicians and spent all of her livelihood, yet instead of getting better, she was getting worse. Luke says that he had suffered many things at the hands of many physicians. How did they know that? How did they know that to record that for us? We act like this is something that took place in a matter of seconds while Jesus is walking through the crowd. But the only way they could know that is if God not only stopped, but took the time to listen to her. That's the only way they could know that. I think sometimes we forget that. As I said last week, most of the commentaries refer to it as kind of a parenthetical miracle. They just kind of pass right on by it and go to the Jairus' daughter, because raising somebody from the dead is a whole lot cooler than just healing somebody that's been sick for a while. I guess. I'm not sure. But the truth of the matter is, there's a lesson here in kindness where Jesus didn't just stop and ask, "Who touched me?" Again, she had already run off by then. Brings her back, and he must have talked to her for enough time for the gospel writers to know about her. And that's something that's important there, that we see that. We look at that, and I think we miss that sometimes. Carl Thomas wrote, "Love talked about is easily ignored, but love demonstrated is irresistible." Jesus didn't just talk about love and kindness. He showed it for us. He modeled it for us. So let's look in how we see this a little bit. We don't know where he's going. It starts off, the narrative starts off in verse 40. Our reading today started off in verse 49, but the narrative actually starts in verse 40. It says in verse 40, I jumped over the wrong chapter there. That wouldn't read right at all. It says, "When Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue, and falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying." We're not told where Jesus is going. We're told that he came back, and as he came back, there's a large crowd there, and that's important. Probably he's looking for a place where he can go and teach the crowd. He's looking for a place that's open enough that they can get comfortable, and he can teach them as he did. That was his custom, and he did that quite a bit, and we see that, and that was something important to do. But as soon as Jairus came to him, the very next thing after it says, he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying, in verse 42, look at the next three words. I don't know what your translation says. Mine says, "And Jesus went." He didn't waste time. As soon as he saw that this man had this great need, he went. And I think it's important that we understand that Jesus, some translation says, as Jesus was on his way. He's on his way immediately, as soon as he knows what's going on. And evidently, he changed everything to stop what he was doing because there was someone in need. By the way, since we're talking about Jesus' kindness here a little bit, how well do you handle interruptions? I mean, some of us don't do that very well. Most people work best when they can concentrate on one thing or maybe two things at the most, and try to juggle that and try to get it done. I'm really bad sometimes when I'm in the middle of writing something. Sometimes it'll almost feel like I'm writing and the words just flow. I'll sit down sometimes and I can write and write and write, and some of you that have taught or some of you that have written before, you can say, yeah, it happens sometimes. You just sit down and the words just start coming out, and you're not even sure where they're coming from, and it's easy. Other times it's very, very difficult. But you know, there's not much of a worse feeling in the world than when all the words are flowing and it seems like everything's going exactly the way it ought to go, and somebody interrupts your thoughts. Because you can never get the same thoughts going again, or at least I can't. I can sit there for hours trying to figure out, now what was I thinking that led me to write this and this and this and this, and it comes out totally different than the way I had intended it, and I know it's totally different than the way I intended it because of the interruption. We don't like interruptions very much. But Jesus paid attention to this interruption of Jairus, and he changed his plans, just like that. Just like that, he changed his plans. You know, our world's becoming more and more impersonal. Don't you think so? I mean, as I look around, you go to the gas station, you know, we used to call them service stations, but you don't go there for service anymore. As a matter of fact, you don't even go there to talk to anybody anymore. You pull up to the pumps. You don't dare wave at the people at the other pumps, but you pull up at the pumps, you slide your card in, you get your gas, you drive away. You never speak to a single person. You don't even have to wear a mask at the gas station because you're not going to get within 6 feet of anybody. That's not an issue. You know, we that's just automatic. We don't even think. And the bank, man, now they got an app where you can deposit your check without even driving over there. They don't even want you to drive over and see them. I'm not sure that that's the case or why they have the app. It may just be simply for our convenience. But we live in a more and more impersonal society. Instead of going to the doctor, now you call the doctor on the phone, and if you got a computer, you can put the screen up there or your phone up there, and if you got a sore or a sickness or something that you need him to look at, he'll look at it on the screen. They'll do all. Did you ever think, did you ever imagine that you would go to the doctor without leaving your house? And I heard the Speaker of the House this last week complaining that people aren't getting their prescriptions on time because she says the mail's really slow right now. And I thought, well, maybe they ought to mail it a little earlier if that's the problem. But anyhow, people are not getting their prescriptions on time seems to be a big problem. And she threw out some number, 83% of all prescriptions for all veterans are sent through the mail. Wow. They don't even go see the pharmacist. So I guess you don't need a doctor. Can you imagine some lady logging in, using her password, using her login information and everything? Dear doctor, I'm about 3 minutes from having my baby. What do you suggest? Or some guy calling in and saying, hey, I'm in the middle of a heart attack. What do you suggest? But that may come to that at some time. I've heard, I haven't seen it personally, but I've heard that using robotic surgery, a doctor in India performed surgery on a patient in New York City through the computer with robotic surgery. I don't know how that works. I remember when our son was in Iraq and we were talking to him on I don't know what it was called, but one of those apps where you can talk to each other. There was about a 30-second delay. You'd say, how are you doing? And you'd sit there and watch him. And after a little while, he'd say, fine. And then you would immediately respond. But meantime, he's watching you just sitting there. And I thought, how in the world could you do robotic surgery if you got a 30-second delay? Apparently they don't. But it's pretty amazing how impersonal the world has gotten. Try calling one of the airlines. You get a computerized voice. If you would like information concerning your flight, press 1. So you press 1. If it's an arrival, press 1. If it's a departure, press 2. So you press 2 because you want to know about. If you know your flight number, press 1. If you don't know your flight number, press 2. So you press 1 because you know your flight number, and it tells you the correct gate number. And you go through all these processes, and you never, ever have to talk to a person. The other side of that is you never get to talk to a person if you need to. There's no clarification there at all. It's become a very impersonal world. Can you imagine what would happen if they did that at 911? Thank you for calling 911. If your emergency is a homicide, press 1. If your emergency is a burglary, press 2. If the burglar is still in the house, press 3. If the burglar is armed, press 4 in a hurry. You know, that's the world we live in. And in the middle of this world, which wasn't as fast-paced then, or as impersonal then all the time, Jesus took time to stop for both of these miracles. In the midst of, because while we may say, well, the world wasn't as rushed then, Jesus was on a mission. He had a very limited time to reach the entire world. And so it was very important for what he did. He took the time to go for this little girl. He was considerate. Are you a good listener? You know, most of us probably aren't. We pass each other by and we say things to each other like, how you doing? And what we mean is hello, because we don't want to hear. Not unless I'm fine is your answer. And we're okay with that. A one-word answer would even be better if you would just say fine. Then we wouldn't have to hear I'm, because that's you bragging. But just say fine. That's what we expect. We walk through and we pass each other by. Have you ever been caught off guard when you ask somebody how you're doing and they actually told you? There's an awkward moment. I'm in a hurry, and now all of a sudden you're telling me about your daughter, and you're telling me about your surgery, you're telling me about your cat, and you're telling me about your life, and I really don't care. No, I'm not saying that, but that happens to us, doesn't it? Are you a very good listener? Irma Bombeck tells a story about one time when she was really, really tired of listening. Said she'd listened to her son tell her in minute detail about a movie he had seen the night before, punctuated by at least 1,000 you-knows and okays. Then she received several telephone calls filled with what she felt was mindless chatter that never seemed to end, and so it was with genuine relief she's able to tell the last caller she had to rush off to the airport. She got in a taxi cab. As the taxi cab took her to the airport, he told her all about his son who had won a scholarship and was making straight A's at college, and she learned everything there was to know about his son. And then she gets to the airport 30 minutes early, and she's excited because she's 30 minutes early. She said, I can pull out my book and sit there and nobody will bother me because nobody here knows me even. Said, no sooner had I opened my book than an elderly female said, I bet it's cold in Chicago. I suppose, she said, without looking up from her book. And then the woman continued, I haven't been to Chicago for more than 3 years. My son lives there. Irma Bombeck, still hoping to get her privacy back, said, that's nice. The lady continues, my husband's body's on this plane. We were married for 53 years. I don't drive, you see, and the funeral director was so very nice, he drove me to the airport today. Irma recalls her voice droned on and on and on. Here's a woman who didn't want money. She didn't want advice. She didn't want counsel. She just wanted somebody to care enough to listen to her. And she was so desperate for that she was willing to talk to a stranger to get what was missing in her life. She says, as she was boarding the plane, she's sitting in one section and the lady's sitting in another section. Said the lady sits down next to a man on the plane, and Irma Bombeck hears her say to the man, I bet it's cold in Chicago. You see, there are a lot of lonely people in the world. There are a lot of needy people in the world. There are a lot of people in the world we live in today who just need someone who cares enough to stop and listen. And last week we saw Jesus do that, and this week we see Jesus doing the same thing. You're like, Where's the story about raising the little girl from the dead? That's what I want to hear. That's the exciting part. That's just the icing on the cake. The cake itself is Jesus and the way he cares for us. The cake itself is that God listens to our prayers. The cake itself is what Paul writes in Romans when he says that the Spirit who dwells inside of us can go to God on our behalf and speak to God the things that are so deep in our heart that there aren't even words to utter. And that God stops and listens to us. That's the cake. Oh, we all like the icing. I guess we all like the icing. I usually eat my cake around the icing and give the icing to my wife. She likes the icing more than I do. Usually I think the icing's a little sweet, so I'll eat the cake. I love the cake. She loves the icing. We're both happy, and I guess that works really, really well. But there are so many people in the world today who just need someone to listen to them. And there's an example that Jesus gave us, to stop and to listen to people. Finally, he showed a little bit of understanding and compassion. He goes to the house. We like the story. He goes to the house. The mourners are there. Now, I've heard sermons that these are professional mourners and that the Jews would hire professional keeners and mourners that would come around and do your mourning for you so that you could mourn in peace. They would do all the wailing and yelling and hollering and stuff like that. And there were people that were paid to do that. I know some folks today that could probably make a good living at it because that's pretty much the way their attitude is all the time. But having said that, I don't think that's the case here. I don't think these are necessarily professional mourners, because when Jairus went, his daughter was sick, about to die. I don't think you go get the mourners before your child dies. I don't think that happens. And so the mourners are there, and they get there, and Jesus says, "What are you all upset about? She's not dead, she's asleep." Well, they know better than that, and so they make fun of him. They make fun of Jesus. You know, I can imagine if some of the fake gospels that are out there were true, I could imagine Jesus just turning them all to stone. He could have done that if he wanted to. Turn them all into blocks of wood. Punish them for what they're doing. At the very least, he could have told them how dumb they were or struck them mute or something like that. We see examples of things like that. Or he could have called in all the bears to come and get them. That happened one time in the Bible too, but none of that happened here. No. Instead, Jesus goes on in to do his business. You know, there's 4 words in the English language that are really hard to hear. Sometimes they're fun to say. I told you so. We like to say I told you so. We don't like to hear I told you so, but we like to say I told you so. And it had to be tempting for Jesus to get ready a good I told you so for these people, because he knows what he's about to do. He knows what's about to happen here. Remember, they've mocked him. He goes into the house and he says to the little girl, Talitha cum, which is, I say to you, little girl, arise. He speaks to her. He reaches down, he takes her by the hand, he helps her up. And then, with all the amazement going on, he tells them to give her something to eat. You know why? I think I have a good idea why he told them to give her something to eat. Because they didn't know what to do. They'd never seen anything like this before. They're in the middle of grief. They just lost their only child. They're sitting there. They don't know what to do. They don't know whether to hug her or touch her. What if we hurt her more? And so he said, give her something to eat. And immediately it gave them something to do. Sometimes when people are hurting, the best thing we can do for them is to help them to have something to do besides sitting around in their grief. And that's what Jesus did here. And then There's the I told you so moment. He could have told Jairus, I told you so. I told you on the way here not to worry about it and I would take care of it. But he didn't. He could have went out to all those mockers. Man, if it had been me, I'd have probably took that little girl by the hand and walked her out there on the porch and said, look at here. I told you so. I told you. Now you need to believe. That'd have been a good sermon illustration, I'd think. I'd think that'd be a great time for Jesus to prove to everybody, look who I am. But he didn't do any of that. He didn't do any of that at all. He was concerned about how they felt, too. We don't think of that all the time. He didn't try to get back at them or anything like that. Love the story about the 6'10" wrestler. He walks into a McDonald's and he slams his fist down on the table. He says, I want half a Big Mac sandwich. The little girl behind the counter, she looks up at him and she's like, this guy's a monster. He's huge. But she doesn't know how to act, doesn't know how to respond. They don't sell half a Big Mac sandwich. They sell a Big Mac sandwich. And so she goes to her manager. She doesn't realize the guy is following her. And she goes down to the other end of the manager and she said, boss, she said, I don't know what to do. She said, there's this great, big, huge idiot. He's dumb as a box of rocks, and he wants half a Big Mac sandwich. And she looks around and sees the guy behind her. She said, and this fine gentleman here wants the other half. You know, sometimes it's not what we say, it's how we say it, right? We need to be real careful sometimes. Somebody may put us on the spot. And what we say is very important. It is important. But how we say it can be even more important. It's about our love. It's about our kindness. It's about us being like Jesus. I hadn't talked much about Jairus. We haven't talked much about his daughter. We haven't talked much about this great miracle. But we have talked about this great God. And we have talked about this great love. Because that's the message that we really get out of this. Several years ago, some construction workers were working on a building across the street from a children's hospital. And they were on the 3rd floor working. And one day as they were working, they saw a little girl in the window of the hospital across the way. And she had a sign out. And her sign says, my name is Lisa. What are your names? So the men the next day carried back signs of their own. My name is Bob, my name is Mike, my name is Bill, whatever. How old are you? And so the next day she shows up with another sign. I'm 7 years old. And this went on and on and on. How old are you? She asked, and each of them told her how old they were. And for several days, over the course of several weeks, she would bring a sign one day, and they would bring a sign the next day, and they would kind of talk back and forth across the buildings. And then one day she didn't show up. And so the workers, one of them went over to the hospital to check, and they said, hey, there's a girl named Lisa up on the 3rd floor, and we've been communicating. They said, well, Lisa's very, very sick. She has leukemia, and she's gotten very, very ill. And so they got together, and they got her some flowers. And they sent her some flowers and some balloons, and they all made signs saying, get well. And a few weeks later, as they were working, there was a sign in the window. Dear construction workers, Lisa has passed on to her reward. Thank you for loving her. Our God has asked us to take time in our lives to care about other people. That's the message of Jairus' daughter. It's not that Jesus was able to raise the dead. He did that many times. It's not that Jesus was able to talk to people or heal a disease. He did that many times. It's that Jesus cared, and so should we. So should we. Maybe you're not a child of God this morning. We care. We don't want you to be lost. We don't want you to go away from here not knowing your hope, not knowing the promise, not being in a relationship with Jesus Christ. If you've never been baptized into Christ and you're still outside of Christ, we don't want you to leave here outside of Christ. And if you're in Christ and you're not right here, we want you to come back to Christ. If you need to respond, we're going to give you an opportunity to do that. Just stand where you are. Someone will come to you. We're going to sing a song to encourage you.